Tevi Troy is a best-selling author. He's also a PhD from Texas. His latest book is called Fight House, chronicling the history of conflict in the White House from the presidencies of Truman all the way through to the modern times of President Trump. Now, Tevi is a best-selling author from the Regnery Publishing House. Regnery and us, we're all partnered up pretty closely, and we enjoy hanging out with one another. So that means that we have Scott Husing producing and hosting this episode with me. He also is a best-selling author of the book Echo and Ramadi. By the way, one of the great ways to support the show is to click on the links, because that takes you to the Amazon link where you can buy, and we get a little bit of that sale, so that always helps out. But also, when you are on and you're buying books, it's the best way to support the show and support the authors is to buy the book through our link and then leave a little review and a 5-star rating. These things, like once you get past a certain number of reviews, the author is forever going to make money on that book. It'll always be ranked above other books. So that's a big help. Hey, Tevi is super knowledgeable about the White House. He's been the Assistant Secretary to Health and Human Services and a bunch of other high-level White House positions. You can look him up at tevitroy.org. I almost said his name wrong. tevitroy.org. And you can always look up Scott at echoandramadi.com, and you can look me up at pdaveturner.com. Gosh, my website needs a desperate updating. But I will tell you this, though. This is a cool episode. You're going to learn about how conflict in the White House either helps or hurts the presidencies, especially once you mix in the conflicts that happen outside of the White House and then how all that exacerbates it. We love talking about presidencies. We love talking about the history of it. We actually have a really cool show coming up this week that you're going to enjoy about that. So I've given you an idea how to support the show. I know you're going to like Tevi Troy's episode. And then one last thing that I'm going to say, and that is to support Save the Brave. That's our charity for the show. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. Go there, click on the donate tab, put a small amount of money in each month. Just an amount you won't even miss. Would you buy me lunch? Would you buy John lunch? Would you buy Scott lunch? Okay, $25 a month. That's it. That's all we're asking for. That will make such a difference in how we help veterans with PTSD. So things on our list today to do is stay safe, stay healthy, enjoy Tevi Troy.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Tevi Troy. You're listening to the Break It Down show with Pete and Scott on Fight House.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we're talking to a Regnery author named Tevi Troy, and Scott's like, hey, let's get this guy on and talk about his book. I wanted to, before we get too much into that book, talk about your previous book because it's super topical right now, Wake the President, and what happens with disasters and presidents. How is it to have an older book that you wrote a couple years ago all of a sudden become super mainstream and important?
Well, it's kind of fun. I wrote this book, Shall We Wake the President, in 2016. It tells you something about it, that the book was written without either Hillary or Trump mentioned in it, both of whom became the presidential candidates that year. Obviously, Trump was the winner. But the book just came out in paperback this week, and it's actually available on Costco. Somebody sent me a picture of seeing a big stack of them on Costco. So the book is a hot topic right now. People are worried what to do about coronavirus. I actually have specific ideas and suggestions inside Shall We Wake the President of what people should do when you have some kind of disease outbreak, an unfamiliar disease outbreak. And there's specific actionable steps that I suggest everybody take.
Well, hey, I first want to say that how this network is connected, again, blows my mind because, and I'm up in the office at Regnery and I said, hey, what books are great right now? And he grabs the first one off. He goes, you got to read this one from Tevi. And so that's how Tevi comes on the show with us today. And I think that, we get a ton of authors on this show. And the question I have for you, Tevi, the first one is not just Shall We Wake the President, which is extremely topical right now. You never know the impact it's going to have when you write something a month or 2 months or 2 years later. But this book and your job as a journalist and presidential historian, I'd like to have you tell everybody your career path that led you into this, and then talk a little bit more about Fight House and going back and doing all the research for this book specifically.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Scott. That's a great question. And it is really great that Alex plugged the book to you. Alex is not only a fantastic publisher, but he's also the son of the famous columnist Bob Novak. And Bob Novak's columns were very helpful in
Crossfire. Loved it.
That's right. For years, he would talk about fighting inside White Houses, and I got such an early picture early on in my career of fighting inside White Houses from Bob's columns. And Alex even wrote the preface, which is a little unusual for a publisher, but I really encouraged him to do it. He wrote the preface of Fight House because he was touched that I used so much of his father's work in the book. My career started after college. My first job, I moved down to Washington. I worked at the American Enterprise Institute. I looked at all those cool people there who, again, to a nerd, they're cool, but all those cool people there who are advising senators, presidents, cabinet members, and going on TV and writing books. And I said, wow, that's a cool way to live. I want to do that. How do I get to do that? But I realized you're not going to do that as a 22-year-old. So I tried to figure out what they had done before they got to have those cool perches as advisors to presidents and cabinet members, et cetera. And I saw three things. Number one was they all had some kind of advanced degree. So I recommend people go to graduate school if you want to pursue. Number two is they had some kind of government experience. They worked in government, so they knew how government worked and operated, what government's limitations were, what government's capabilities were. And that informed what they had to say. And then the third, and this led to my writing career, is they had some kind of well-received book or article that kind of made their name. Jeane Kirkpatrick, for example, was at AEI when I was there. She became UN ambassador, in part because Ronald Reagan read a famous commentary article that she wrote called Dictatorship and Double Standards. Reagan was taken by the argument that said communist dictatorships never make the migration to become democracies without obviously some kind of revolution. They don't migrate to free status, whereas authoritarian nations can make that migration. And what she argued, in effect, was you have to take a hard line on communist and totalitarian countries, and authoritarian countries, you can encourage them and make them move in the right direction. And that was read by Ronald Reagan, and she became UN ambassador as a result. So those three things, again, graduate degree, some kind of government service, and some kind of well-received book or article that helps make your name, I thought would get me into that think tank space. And so I actually went and did those things. I went to University of Texas, got a PhD. I wrote a dissertation that I thought I could publish as a book. It was on intellectuals in the American presidency. It became my first book. And then I started working in government. I worked in the House of Representatives, the Senate. And then I was in the Bush administration in the White House. And I became Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is where I learned all that stuff about disaster preparedness. And after the Bush administration ended, I went to a think tank like I had long planned. I went to the Hudson Institute and I started writing books. I wrote a book about presidents and pop culture, what Jefferson read, Ike watched, and Obama tweeted. I wrote that book about disaster prep, Shall We Wake the President? And now we're here to talk about my new book, Fight House, Rivalries in the White House, from Truman to Trump.
When you look at the rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump, why was Truman the starting point?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, there were rivalries in American politics and in all politics through time immemorial. But what happened in the U.S. was during the Roosevelt administration, government was getting bigger and bigger, and there was a commission called the Brownlow Commission. This commission had a famous four-word conclusion. The conclusion was, the president needs help. And it suggested that you create a series of administrative assistants to the president, White House aides, with a, quote, passion for anonymity. And these folks would then go and do the bidding of the president. They would report to him on what's going on in government, but they would also take the president's direction for the orders and go out there and make them happen. And so Truman is the first president after this commission to enter with a White House staff. And what I argue in Fight House is that all kinds of dynamic changes take place once you have a White House staff, once you have people who are advising the president who are next to him, who are different than the cabinet members who think they should be the primary advisors on all sorts of things. Also, this passion for anonymity goes away. And these White House aides aren't actually anonymous, but they become famous in their own right. And that brings with it journalistic relationships, the ability to leak to the press, sometimes big egos, big jobs at stake afterwards. And so suddenly the stakes get higher, the profile and the spotlight gets bigger, and the tensions with the cabinet get greater. And all those lead to the mix of increased rivalries and increased fighting that I highlight in my book, Fight House.
This is fascinating to me because we've done a lot of work. I've been to the Reagan Ranch Center and to Nixon Library and getting a really behind the scenes look at some of the great leaders of our country and even some of the more controversial ones. And I think in your book, the chapter about the Clinton administration is probably when we came to the media age where everything about the president was really blasted on mainstream media. And I think the American public had access to every detail and facet of what the president was doing, not only on the world stage, but also in their private lives. Do you think there was a specific era, or do you think that the Clinton administration was probably where the fuse was lit with this as well?
Oh, I think that's a really good point about Clinton. Fox News starts in the Clinton era. The internet really takes off in the Clinton era. The Clinton advisors had this rule during the campaign of 1992, which is never let a charge go unanswered in a news cycle. So they were constantly responding to the news cycle. Everything was just much more in your face, and you're much more aware of things. There's a Reagan administration aide, I quote in the book, Peter Robinson, and obviously that was not that long before Clinton, but it was obviously before it. And the Reagan aide, Peter Robinson, said, "Of course we had fighting in the Reagan White House. We just didn't have Twitter, Twatter talking about it all the time." And so the rise of 24-hour cable, the rise of the internet, the rise of social media, all these factors contributed. And then you add on top of that, reporters, I think in the Kennedy administration, were kind of burned. They didn't talk about Kennedy's dalliances, even though every one of them knew about it. And suddenly the new attitude after Watergate and after Nixon was, we're going to talk about this stuff. We're going to get it all out there, and we're going to win Pulitzer Prizes and journalistic awards for being the first ones out there to talk about this stuff. And so there's no more holding back from the media. The media became a player in a way that they had not before. And so whereas the Reagan administration, some of the feuds could go under radar, that was no longer the case once you get to Clinton and the subsequent administrations.
Do you think that you say, yeah, we're going to win a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on sex scandal? Do you think that that was also, as many people assert, kind of the downfall of journalism, like it's circling the drain when we start reporting on this? Not that it's not important, but you use the word like tabloid a lot. It becomes this tabloid-like reporting where we're steering away from, I guess for lack of a better term, more important issues of what the president is doing, vice the things that kind of all presidents and all people have done since the beginning of man.
Yeah, look, journalists are people too. I think what's happened now in the internet age is that the journalists are revealed for who they are, right? You keep reading these things about, there was just an ABC News journalist suspended because he admitted that he's a socialist and can't stand the president and all this stuff. With social media, these journalists are tweeting, and you see that they're not necessarily the neutral, nonpartisan arbiters of what's important, but they actually have their own perspectives, their own opinions. And it's great. Everyone's allowed to have their own opinion. But once it comes into your journalism, then you start to question the journalistic enterprise. And I think you're right that journalists were looking for the salacious rather than the substantive, because that's what sells papers. And obviously there's more competition today. You've got the electronic media. You don't necessarily sell as many hard copies of a paper today. You've got to get clicks online, and you have instant gratification. If you put a piece out there, you can see how many clicks that piece is getting. And that drives you to write more pieces like the one that gets the clicks, as opposed to the one that might be on the substance of a tax bill, but that doesn't get so many clicks.
When you look at the history of presidential organizations and administrations, who stands out as being particularly combative and who's particularly consensus driven?
It's a good question. The Ford administration was very combative. There was a lot of infighting in the Ford administration, kind of surprising in some ways because you think of Jerry Ford as a nice guy. But there are two interesting things that happened in the Ford administration. Number one is the very fact that Ford is a nice guy. I think he was unable to control the infighting, especially with people who were close to him. A guy named Bob Hartman, who was a former journalist, knew Ford for a long time, was a very problematic actor inside the Ford White House, but Ford really wasn't willing to rein him in because they were personal friends. The second thing is Ford is the only person to become president without running on a national ticket.
Right.
He didn't articulate a vision. And so all the aides are fighting over what the Ford vision is because the president has never gotten out there and articulated it. So I think that is a challenge. When you talk about consensus, I think some of the recent presidents like Bush and Obama, Bush 43 and Obama, tried to have consensus-driven, process-run White Houses, and they really didn't want to see infighting, and they talked about how they were against infighting. Bush was the first NBA president and wanted to have a process-driven White House. Obama had the famous no-drama Obama. But even there, as I lay out in Fight House, there were plenty of fights that took place in those administrations. What you find is it's a little like whack-a-mole, where you try and control it in one place and it pops out elsewhere. So in the Bush administration, for example, I thought Bush did a really good job on domestic policy and trying to maintain that consensus and collegiality. But on foreign policy, you had Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, and they were at each other's throats. And you read all kinds of stuff about it during the administration, more since the administration that I talk about in Fight House. In the Obama White House, I think he, again, had this idea of no drama Obama. He limited fighting to some degree. But at the same time, fighting definitely emerged. And I talk about a gender-based divide that came out in the Obama White House that we've not seen in previous White Houses.
The follow-up to that then is I'm a bit of a presidential historian myself, and you start to understand that presidents don't control timing. They don't really understand the job well enough to pick their best people to, like you get the NSC you get, but you're not the one you need. There's all these outside factors that take you out of, you don't get to manage the problem the way you would think you do. So what does work? I mean, is it person specific, or is there a specific style that seems to rise to the top? Like this tends to work less shitty than this other form, which always works shitty, because let's be honest, it's hard to get things reliably right as president and get people to agree that you've done it reliably right.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because in Fight House, I actually lay out the 3 levers that a president has in their control in order to limit infighting in the White House. Again, if they so choose. A president may not want to limit infighting. A president might like infighting. A president may see that it builds some creative tensions and sets the juices flowing and all that. But if they so choose, here are the 3 levers, and I will lay them out in brief, but you can get them in more detail in Fight House. Number 1 is ideological alignment. I mentioned in Ford, you didn't really know where the president stood, so the aides were fighting over what the ideology of the administration was. So if you have ideological alignment, if people are on the same page, you're going to see less fighting. Number 2 is a strict process. I mentioned Bush was very process driven. If you have a process, and that means the way in which paper gets to the president, the way in which decisions are made, the way in which meetings are organized, if you have a fair process in which people get to sit around a table and all the people with equities get to have their say, even if they lose at the end of the day, they feel like they got to say their piece, then you're going to have less infighting and less leaking and less backbiting. And the third thing is presidential tolerance. If a president says, I don't want to see this stuff, you're going to see less of it. That doesn't mean you're going to see none of it, but it is a factor. And so Obama made it very clear he didn't want to see fighting. And I tell a story in the book in Fight House of Alyssa Mastromonaco, who was a deputy chief of staff, who did not like the way she was portrayed in a New York Times article. It wasn't even critical. It was just insufficiently glowing about her. And she sent an email blistering the entire senior staff about leaking against her and people who did stuff to her in that way. And Obama calls her into the Oval the next day. She doesn't know why. She's a deputy chief of staff. There's a million reasons you could be called to the Oval Office to talk to the president in that position. And he looks at her and he says, that was quite the email you sent yesterday, making it very clear that he didn't want to see this kind of stuff take place in his White House. So those 3 levers, ideological alignment, strong, strict process, and presidential intolerance for fighting are the ways a president can control it if they so choose.
But does it work?
Work is an interesting question. So you can have less infighting in a White House. And we see in the LBJ White House, in the Johnson White House, there was in some ways less fighting because Johnson didn't want to see it, because he didn't want to have anybody with views different than his own. Now, I talk about in the same book, in Fight House, in the previous chapter, in the Kennedy administration, Johnson was fighting hammer and tongs with Bobby Kennedy, and they hated each other. But inside the Johnson White House, he didn't really brook dissent. He tried to clamp down on leaking. He actually had the White House operators report back to him on who people were calling, and the White House motor pool report back to him on where people were going. So he didn't want to hear dissent. He tried to clamp down on leaks. And what he ended up with was groupthink over Vietnam, because nobody was really able to question the policy. And there was even a group of staffers at the State Department who were worried about the direction of Vietnam, and they were scared to come together to discuss it. They brought themselves together in a group they called the non-group, because they were so afraid that Johnson would find out about it. And they had secret meetings so that Johnson wouldn't know that there were people within his administration who were questioning the policy. You can, have maybe a Stalinist atmosphere, cut down on infighting, but it doesn't necessarily improve the results.
Just listening to that, it makes me wonder if there was, or maybe if you've even, this just popped into my head, Tevi, or if you even came up with this, with all of the access you have to the stories and everything. If there was a way to measure two things on a scale, the incidence of scandalous behavior and infighting in the White House tied to the effectiveness of the presidency and also a presidential approval rating in the public. I wonder, have you ever thought about that?
So I did think of a version of that. If you look in White House, and I know you've got a copy there. If you look at page 266, where I have the appendix, I have 3 scales where I talk about ideological discord, low to high, process, tight to loose, and tolerance for infighting, low to high. And I measure each administration on those scales, which are really measuring those 3 levers I talk about. And then I talk at the end in the last column about the result, what kind of White House you had in basically one sentence. And so I didn't exactly do it the way you did it in terms of scandals and approval rating, but there are ways of measuring White Houses. Again, it's a subjective measurement from me as a historian, but I don't know anybody who's looked at this stuff more closely, White House to White House, than I have on this particular subject. And so I think you can try and have cross comparisons, but obviously there are external factors and questions about how the media covers one administration or another that may skew the results. But the fact is, I think you can try and do a cross administration comparison. And that's what I try to do in White House.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's a real cool layout. And I noticed one thing. I'll just throw this out there. There's a lot of asterisks in your book with words that start with F and then have 3 asterisks, or D and then 3 asterisks. Like, I don't know. Alex, he let me, I think last count 66 F-bombs in my book. But it's Marine speak. It's kind of our lexicon. So was that a conscious decision? Like, I'm not going to use the actual swear word in my book.
It was actually a conscious decision. And I did a search before I submitted the book of all the bad words in there. And I put in the stars. I noticed one of you guys used the word shitty before.
Yeah.
I try not to curse. I have 4 kids, all under the age of 18. I just try not to curse around them because I don't want them to pick up the habit. And I also wanted them to be able to read this book and not see their father writing those words. Now, I will tell you something interesting, which is I happen to be listening to the audio version of the book, which is great. And I'm only listening to it because I wanted to hear how the voice actor did it. And the voice actor, when it comes to those asterisk words, he says the actual word, which I thought was an interesting choice by him.
That's interesting.
You're the first person to ask me about that, so I really appreciate that.
Well, Well, Tevi, I don't have a doctor in front of my name, so it quickly devolves to this high school mentality every time with me. So, yeah, don't give me too much credit. Pete's the smart guy in the room. He always is. He always lets me know it. And now, so I'm getting two-sided ambush from you and Pete. But one of the things I've always said, and I'll go back to Clinton because I find his presidency fascinating. And I've always asserted to a degree that amidst all the scandal and everything, and he gets bashed for not being a good president. I always thought that it made President Clinton, they called him, he was made of Teflon, nothing stuck to him. I think around the world, as people view our president through a certain lens, Clinton to me always seemed to be this guy that was untouchable, but you never knew what he was going to do. And, it could have been a policy decision or parking tomahawks in North Africa to a scandal with Monica Lewinsky or Flowers or whatever it was. And around the world, I think everyone kind of took a step back because they said, this guy is pretty capable of doing anything. Is he one of the better examples of being able to come through the mire squeaky clean?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, especially because today, when you hear people talk about the 90s, they say, oh, the 90s were an idyllic time, peace and prosperity. Look, I lived through the 90s. Nobody was walking around saying, hey, it's peace and prosperity. They were saying, oh, my gosh, can you see what the president's doing in the Oval Office? Or can you see what the Republicans are trying to do to him for, just having some, extramarital dalliances? I mean, it was not a time where you thought, oh, wow, this is just the most peaceful, wonderful time on earth. And so sometimes you look back on an era differently than it was experienced by the people who lived it. I think Clinton does get a lot of credit. I think I've been, as you know, I'm a Republican. I worked in the George W. Bush White House. But I think I've been very nice to Clinton in all 4 of my books now, because I think he was a very talented person. I think he did care about the direction of the country. I wouldn't say he was less partisan, because he was obviously a partisan, but I think he was willing to do stuff like triangulation, where he tried to get the best ideas from both parties. I think he was willing to read stuff on the other side of the aisle that you don't see from recent presidents. I mean, if you look at Obama's reading, he did read a lot of books, but he never ever read a book by a conservative. He just almost never saw it. And I think that kind of one-sided alignment where you're not reading what the other side is saying, I think is damaging. And I think we'd be better off if we read. I try to read a lot of liberal books and a lot of conservative books because I think we're just better off by hearing what everybody's saying.
That's a rare skill to have, I think, in this day and age, where I personally am very hopeful that there'll be more people saying things like that and admitting that, yes, I went to a Democratic rally just to see that it wasn't a bunch of raving lunatics and get their message, and really balance that with your own views of policy and culture and how to adapt that. And to hear that there's, world leaders, that you rise to the most powerful position on the planet, in this case, when you sit in the White House, and that you're not willing to read outside of your own comfort zone or be educated outside of your own comfort zone, I think speaks volumes about the type of people we really need in there. And what do you think about that? How do we move forward to bring those two sides closer together?
Yeah, look, when I served in the Bush White House, President Bush read a lot. He read 60 to 90 books a year. And he read serious books. And if you look at the list, he was reading books by conservative authors, liberal authors. He was reading presidential biographies. He read 14 biographies about Lincoln while he was president.
Wow.
That's a lot of Lincoln biographies. And you would have these meetings where he would just, there was no publicity about them. He would just bring in some professors and academics to talk to them about books and ideas. And they were always amazed at how well read Bush was. So I think that is definitely a useful skill. Clinton was also a wide and varied reader. Harry Truman was a huge reader. He used to say, the only thing that's new in this world is the history you haven't read yet. And I think that, and Truman is also the last president not to go to college. So Truman was an autodidact, but he really took it seriously, and he was constantly reading on stuff, and it helped shape some of his policies in a positive direction. In Fight House, I tell the story about the big fight about the recognition of the state of Israel. And national security establishment was opposed to recognizing Israel, especially Secretary of State George Marshall. Clark Clifford was a White House aide who was charged with making the case for the state of Israel. And he did it in a meeting in the White House in front of Truman and in front of Marshall. And Marshall is irate that this pipsqueak Clifford is challenging his brilliance. And he even kind of tries to put him down in the meeting. What's Clifford doing here? And Truman says, well, General, meaning General Marshall, he's here because I asked him to be here. And he lets Clifford make the case. And Clifford makes an effective case, but it's also coupled with the fact that Truman was a big reader. He used to read this book as a kid called Great Men and Famous Women that talked about Cyrus the Great, the king who let the Jews leave the Babylonian exile and go back to Israel to rebuild the Holy Temple. And as a result of Clifford's strong argument and Truman's reading, they do decide to recognize the state of Israel, which is a great idea since Israel's a staunch ally of ours and the only democracy in the Middle East today. And Marshall is so mad that he loses this argument that he never again speaks to Clifford or utters his name for the rest of his life.
Wow.
How's that for holding a grudge?
Yeah. And I like that you pointed out the fact that George Bush, the younger, is such a powerful reader. I mean, we have these perceptions that he's an idiot, right? But he does have 2 Ivy League degrees. He does have a stack of books that you go walk down the street and meet 1,000 people and look at their book stack. He's going to have more books in that stack than anybody else. And it did inform how he administrated and how he made decisions, and yet it still didn't work out very good.
Yeah, it's true. Karl Rove said that in the 40 years he knows George W. Bush, he's never seen him without a book in hand. So yeah, he was a big reader. And I talk about this a lot in my second book, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted. And I say that Bush is not blameless in this regard. There's a reason there's a perception of him as kind of a cowboy and not a sharp, smart guy, is because he lost a congressional race in 1978 to a guy named Kent Hance, who derided him as a pointy-headed Northeastern intellectual with those 2 Ivy League degrees and just mercilessly mocked him in West Texas about that kind of background that he had. And he lost the race, and Bush promised, I'll never be out cowboyed again. And so from then on, he wore the leather jacket, the cowboy hat, the boots, and he didn't talk publicly about his reading. And he just showed himself to be a regular guy, successfully won governor twice, then wins the presidency as this regular guy. And then he realizes that people perceive him as this guy who's not so smart, not so well educated. And he tries to change it. He does do all that reading, and he does try and bring intellectuals and academics into the White House. And he does have an Office of Strategic Initiatives that's specifically designed to reach out to intellectuals. But it's too late. You don't really get a second chance to make a first impression with the American people.
The book is, I want to talk about the access and your access specifically, not only being in the White House under the Bush administration, but going back through time, pulling all of the information. How do you gain access to some of the more juicy parts of this book and some of the stories you tell, and that obviously you can't even put in 300 pages? I mean, there's got to be volumes of great stories about these presidents, and not just the infighting, but the great things too. So talk to me about the access, and then talk about some of the things that you wish you could have put in this book that didn't make the cut.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And every time you write a book, every single time, wherever you are, whatever kind of book you are writing, you have to make some strategic decisions about what you're going to include and how you're going to approach it, and what's going to be the information base from which you choose to your material. And even in fiction, I mean, there are areas of your head you may not want to explore, but in nonfiction especially, how am I going to go about doing this book? And the question I got while I was writing the book more than anything else is, are you doing interviewing? Who you're interviewing? And I specifically decided for this book not to do interviews. And I'll tell you why. Number one is, I feel like people lie to interviewers. They'll say, oh, well, it was all hunky-dory in my White House, or this guy was an SOB and maybe he wasn't. But they give their perception and not the actual reality. Number two is, I didn't want to have a whole bunch of interviews that only I had access to. And then I selectively picked from those interviews and said, here's the stuff. You don't get to see it, but I'm going to choose from these interviews and say something that's different than the entire historical record. So I very consciously said, everything in this book is going to be in the historical record that people have seen or can see or can access if they so want. They can go to presidential libraries. They can go to the oral histories in the Miller Center. They can read the journalistic accounts or the historical accounts. And I'm bringing it together, stringing it together with my own interpretation, but I'm really not using any secret material. I will say there's one counterexample of this. There was one story that somebody told me that I included in the book that was so good that I could not include it. And I actually put a footnote in there explaining how this guy told me the story. And I used it. And I'll just tell the story quickly. It was about Bill Kristol in the George H.W. Bush White House. Had a reputation of being a leaker. And there was one meeting in which he goes into the press secretary's office, and the meeting is going on while Kristol walks in, and the press secretary just stops when Kristol walks in the room, folds his arm, and won't say another word until Kristol leaves the room, because he felt like Kristol was a leaker. And this guy who was in the meeting told me that story, and I felt it was just too good not to use. I will say that I also had a parallel in the historical record on that story, because when Arthur Schlesinger writes his book about the Kennedy administration called 1,000 Days, he has a very harsh portrait of Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State under Kennedy. And he described Rusk as Buddha-like, sitting there silently in meetings. And Rusk later said, after the book came out, he said, the only reason I was silent in meetings when Schlesinger was there is because he was such a blabbermouth and he would talk about everything that was said in the Georgetown cocktail party. So that's why I was silent around him. At least silent other times.
Well, you talk about Kristol being a leaker, and then I'm looking in the appendix too. You've got this great section here about all these nicknames, which, I mean, from what you just said, is this all historical record? And then you reference Dave Gergen as Professor Leakey in Reagan's administration. The nicknames are hilarious. I mean, so I'm bringing this up because we're talking about the access you have and where the information comes from, but then some really notable figures who are journalists and senior White House cabinet members and administrators. But this book it's not just I'm dying to get more out of it, because it's not just a historical recantation of what goes on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of funny stuff in here too that is just not just humorous, but extremely interesting. And there's a backstory to every one of these nicknames that you have. How did you make the decision to throw this in the book as well?
Well, so much of it is colored by what's going on at the time. So you'd read these articles about nicknames in the Trump administration. And I actually read in a book where Steve Bannon talked about how Trump liked a book by Carl Jung, and Jung talked about nicknames as something having to do with the Jungian archetypes. I don't know if it was all made up or not, but I just thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I realized that I had a lot of nicknames in the book. And so I just started to make a running list of all the nicknames that I found in every administration, pretty much from Kennedy on is when the nicknames start. And at the end, I said, this would be a great appendix. And so that's why I put it all together. And actually, the Washington Examiner ran a little piece about all the nicknames that I have in the book. So it's worth looking at as well.
When you start digging into the archives, you start to realize there's a book, gosh, there's a volume of books. I mean, I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head, but he's written a multi-volume, just complete biography of Johnson, and he's still doing it to this day. It's become his life's work, because you go, and he's like super detailed. Like you go through every single paper in the archive, then you write the book and you put these things together. Do you find yourself just overwhelmed with ideas for what to write next? Because it doesn't seem like there's any shortage of interesting ways to reconstitute all of this history into something that we didn't know before.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Do you find yourself just overwhelmed with ideas for what to write next? Because it doesn't seem like there's any shortage of interesting ways to reconstitute all of this history into something that we didn't know before.
Yeah, it's a great question. Robert Caro, famously, who wrote those Johnson books, has this motto, which is turn over every paper, look at every document. I can't claim to do that. I try and be as comprehensive as I can. I'm trying to tell a story. And I start looking at administration, and I say, okay, this is the story I want to tell. There was a fight between, let's say, Dick Morris in the Clinton administration and George Stephanopoulos and Harold Ickes. And I actually started it as just Stephanopoulos versus Morris. And then the more I looked into it, I realized that Harold Ickes, who knew Morris for 30 years and hated him from New York politics, they were rivals back there, was an important part of the story as well. So the story I want to tell can change based on what the historical record tells me. But I go in saying, I want to tell this story. The story of how these two people hated each other in the White House. And then I try and find every historical record, every document, every interview on that subject and weave it together in a way that it keeps people interested in turning the pages.
Who stands out? Like when you look at different administrations, some people end up staying, like Jack Brennan has been a advisor to other chiefs of staff and everything. Who stands out as being someone who's able to just sort of hang around the White House and always be useful regardless of which party occupies the House?
Well, number one is the guy we've already mentioned, Professor Leakey himself, and Gergen, David Gergen. And look, Gergen served in the Nixon White House, the Ford White House, Reagan White House, and the Clinton White House. And he was always involved in some kind of backstabbing, leaking, sharp-elbowed behavior. And, you look at him on TV, and I've actually met him, and, he seems like such a genial guy. But, man, this guy knew how to fight. And, there's that famous scene in the White House Situation Room when Reagan is shot. And Al Haig is told not to go upstairs and say, I'm in charge here, but he does it anyway. And in that scene, Gergen excused himself a number of times from the room. And some people were speculating that he was doing it in order to leak to his sources in the press. So, he was leaving the room for a variety of reasons. It was either actually to leak or to take a leak. I don't know which one. But it is interesting that was his perception every time he left the room. He was probably leaking somewhere. So yeah, I think Gergen stands out.
The whole entomology of these nicknames could be a whole book in and of itself. And
right,
I tell you, man, I love this appendix too. Trump's could be an appendix in and of itself because he's the master of giving nicknames, as everybody knows. But let's shift to the current presidency and all the material that's out there and some of your. I always like to get your perspective as a guy that's on the inside. And, Pete and I are both veterans, so we view things through a certain lens. And, at the outset of this administration, 2016, I was pleased to see what Trump was doing, surrounding himself and kind of bolstering his decision-making ability about what he didn't know, similar to what we were talking about George W. Bush and surrounding himself with great people because he was a master at he knew what he didn't know, and he was going to bring those people in it for their counsel, for their sage guidance. And I thought that was really wise of President Trump to do that with guys like John Kelly and Jim Mattis and Zinke and all of these other veterans who were kind of giving his counsel, not to be warmongering, but to give him perspective of what the military leadership model can provide for his type of leadership, which I think is different on this on a scale of balance. What are your thoughts on that, and how he's moved past it, and the quick turnover within this administration?
Look, I think a president, especially a president who's new to the game, needs to figure out what works for him. And I think some of the turnover is reflective of the fact that he's trying to figure out what works for him. I also think that I don't know the full story of this administration. I was loath to do too much about this administration because whatever you write about an ongoing administration gets dated very quickly. And also, I feel like we have some journalistic accounts and we have some memoirs of people who were there for 20 minutes and then left. But I don't think we have the full picture yet. And so in Fight House, what I try and do is provide a full picture of administrations after they are over, once we have access to a lot of these historical records, once we have access to some of the memoirs from the more serious people who work there. And then you can tell the real story. I think the Trump story remains to be written. And even in Obama, I have a lot more information about the Obama administration than I would have had I written the book while the administration was ongoing. But I think more is going to come out. Obama's book still is supposed to be coming. They're going to be the oral histories aren't going to come out for another 10 years or so. So it takes a while for this stuff to happen. And I'll be continuing to write because, White House is a never-ending business proposition, right? I can always talk about fighting in the White House no matter who's president in 2050.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like the current presidency, whatever it is, it's always hard to evaluate what's happening. I do want to ask, I want to back up on that thing too. Do you have a sense for when a president sort of figures it out? Like they all struggle initially because it's just such a big job and it's so impossible and you're trying to balance so many things. Who transitioned the most quickly? What's like the basic timeline? It takes a good 2.5 years to get to where you're competent and you're not, other than the current president right now, not doing unforced errors that cause your administration even more problems.
And that's a really good question. I think sometimes the people who are the most experienced come in with the most knowledge of how government operates. So LBJ, for example, knew what he wanted and pretty quickly, he told the Kennedy aides to stay, but he pretty quickly created his own parallel organization within the White House. So he kept the Kennedy aides around, but he didn't actually use them, and he brought in his own people, and he did it the way he wanted. Again, I'm not saying it all worked because we had the groupthink Vietnam problem, but I think he knew what he was. He was burning to be president every minute, including those 3 painful years when he was vice president and miserable. So I think he's one who kind of hit the ground running. I think George H.W. Bush knew a lot about the operation of government, had been vice president previously. Nixon also was vice president previously and had been a senator and kind of knew the way the government operated and what they wanted to do going in. That doesn't mean everything worked out great for these people in their administrations. Johnson famously didn't run for re-election in 68 because of Vietnam, and Nixon got impeached and didn't and resigned. And then George H.W. Bush lost after 1 term. But I think in terms of quickly hitting the ground running and knowing what they wanted to do, I think all those presidents were good on that front. And
well, also Truman was vice president also before he jumped in.
Yeah, but Truman was not written in or read into anything. He was not aware of what was going on. He famously didn't know about the atom bomb or the Manhattan Project at all. So Truman really had to learn after. He kind of had to learn by doing.
The other thing I wanted to ask too about these things is, like Scott was saying, there's a lot of military guys in the Trump White House. And for, I don't know, for our perspective, we've had so many commanders, we have a lot of tolerance for the commander gets to decide how they want to run their stuff. You may not disagree with it, but your job is to get behind the plow and start pushing, like get this thing going forward. So yeah, though I don't really care for how the president does things, whoever it is, it is their call. Like they are left with the policy. They've got to decide if it works, if they're going to change it. And there are so many policies. I think we've developed some thin skin for how we perceive the president, and then also what they're actually allowed to do. Like it is It is their call. They are hired to do this job, and whether or not they do it poorly, that's a good conversation. But how they do it, the how, really, it belongs to them. Or am I wrong about that?
No, I think you're totally right. What was Truman's favorite, famous saying was, "The buck stops here," right? I mean, it's the president who gets to decide. Bush called himself the decider. People made fun of his syntax for that, but that's ultimately what the decision is. And what you get to do as president is you don't get to write legislation yourself. You don't get to move mountains or rescue people or fight war yourself. You get to make decisions. They are difficult decisions, and you're the one who has to make them. And Colin Powell has actually talked about this, that the easiest decisions in government are made by career officials with the field manual out at the local level. And the harder the decision gets, the closer it migrates to the Oval Office. So the 90-10 decisions are being made by the people out in the field with that manual, whereas the 50.5 to 49.5 decisions, the really ones that are on the kind of on the edge, on the knife's edge, are the ones that have to go to the Oval Office and get made by the president himself. And so that's why there's no easy decisions as president. Only the toughest ones make it to your desk.
The nameplate on your desk says presidential historian. So I could see where the Trump administration is really something that time will tell. And I'm curious to know, you as a presidential historian, the balance of volumes that'll be written about this president and how he leveraged things like social media and his catering to the everyday American and really being a master at the game. Because I think that that's one of the things, whether you love him or hate him, Trump is all about winning, and he understands the rules in the game. And the way to win the game is to know the rules. And he plays by those rules. And I think the public doesn't really understand that from the political perspective. As a historian, are you one of those guys that you wake up in the morning and is like, man, when this is all over, I can't wait to write about this? And then the second part of that question is, how long after a president's term is over should you wait to start writing about it? What makes the best story?
Yeah, it's a great question. George W. Bush, for whom I worked, used to say, I don't worry about my historical reputation because they're still writing books about the first George W., meaning George Washington. He was president 200 years ago. And, you still have books that come out and bring out new material about even someone like Washington, who's been dead for hundreds of years. So I think that the historian's job is to get the maximum amount of information available at the time and write the right interpretation given that information. Look, with Eisenhower, he was seen as kind of a buffoon by the mainstream media at the time. And then it was only in the early 70s when Fred Greenstein writes The Hidden Hand Presidency that he actually talked about Eisenhower's brilliant maneuvers behind the scenes. So I don't think we know the full story with any president at the time. And I think the more time goes by, the more you can learn about it. I think one of the key things, and one source that I used heavily in Fight House, are the oral histories that the Miller Center makes available. They're not available until 10 years after the administration's over, so we don't have access to them for Obama, and we won't have access to them for Trump until 2031 or 2035. Mm-hmm. But the more that information comes out, the more you can actually know about what was happening at the time. I like to look, so let's say you mentioned the Trump administration. I'd like to see the first wave of memoirs from people who were there for a long time, the memoirs from the president, although I think memoirs from presidents don't always tell the full story. I think that the Trump library or even the Obama library, that their materials aren't going to be available for a while. I think you've got a lot of forgettable books about this current administration that have already been written. And I think some serious historians will take a deeper dive look, more serious look at the administration. I think that will also be a useful source. So again, the story has to end before you can write the story of what happened. And that's how I'm looking at it.
Look at the comeback that Truman had in his presidency. You wonder also if George W. will have a similar comeback over time. And some of these things, you have to see the outcomes. You can't write them in the moment. As you said, the first George W. is still being evaluated, and we're still trying to decide if Lincoln did the right thing. And all of these things evolve so dramatically over time. It makes me laugh when people say this is the worst thing ever of presidents, and they can't even name 20 presidents, let alone 40 plus.
Well, look, let's say in 2050, Iraq at that point is a democracy for 50 years. New Orleans is a better city than it was in 25, and the economy has had no major recession since the 29 bailouts. You might look back and say, hey, maybe George W. Bush was a pretty good president, but we don't know. So
That's great. Yeah.
You just have to do and wait and play it out.
I think that, again, I've written about this and I've said it about America being this fast food society. We want fast cash at the ATMs. We want fast food at McDonald's. We want fast democracy. And democracy isn't something that happens overnight. And I think you mentioned something that's near and dear to Pete and I is Iraq specifically, and how that country is developing after it's been around 4,000 years. We expect, even after this 14-year war, that it's just going to automatically start growing flowers and commerce and democracy like we've grown in this country for 244 years, which is pale in comparison to the history of that region. And I think that you really, really bring up a great point to emphasize, I think, from your perspective on how the American public can really judge presidents in the future and how much time needs to go by. What do you tell the average American when we live in a society like this on being patient?
Well, as you suggest, it's not a society that's known for patience. In fact, I once had an idea for a book that I didn't pursue, but I have lots of ideas for books. It's called Impatient Nation. We want everything all the time right away. And you just don't get that. It's just not the way life works. Life is, you get up in the morning and you go to work and you do your best and you see how this day plays out and then you see how Tuesday goes. And I just don't think you can get all the information you want about everything all the time. Now, we do have access to more information than any other generation in human history, which is an amazing thing. Heather McDonald likes to say that young people today have at their fingertips what Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. It's a great formulation. So we do know so much more than we ever did, but you can't know everything and you can't know the future. And so I think that's why I counsel patience on all this stuff.
So what are the great ideas besides Impatient Nation for the next thing coming for you, Tevi? What are you dying to write about?
I actually have a great idea for a book. I'm not yet sharing what the idea is because it takes me 3 to 4 years to write a book, and I don't want somebody to jump in the interim period. But I will give you a hint. It is a 3-word concept, and the first 2 words are presidents and.
Presidents and pets.
No, that's Rob. That's Robin Hutton. That's Robin. Presidents and Pets. She's the animal author at Regnery. She's and a dear friend of mine. I love Robin. Right, Robin. She's going to be on the show here real soon as well. But what you've given in this book, Fight House, is such a really fascinating look at what you've seen growing up, and not only from a historical perspective, Tevi, but some of the more lighter hearted anecdotes that you seem to have captured in Fight House as well. If people want to find out more about this book, I know it's on Amazon right now. It's doing great. So if there's people listening to the show, you like learning about presidents, U.S. government, politics, definitely go on Amazon, type in Fight House. Tevi's name will pop right up as TEVI. Don't forget, when you buy the book, read it, leave a review on Amazon, tell everybody what you thought of the book. But where else can people find you, Tevi?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there's an audio version, so you can get it on Audible, and there's an audio CD. You can get it wherever fine books are sold. You can get it at your local bookstore, I hope. And you can also go to Regnery, the publisher, directly from Regnery Publishing. Fight House, it's a great read. I recommend it highly.
Hey, thanks for coming on the show, man. That's really cool. It's a good conversation. I love presidential conversations. I just get such a kick out of it.
All right, well, let's do it for my next book when it comes out in a couple years.
You got it.